Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session on building thinking classrooms in mathematics. My name is Michelle McCarran, and I'll be starting the presentation with just a brief notice and wonder activity so that we can have a little peek into a classroom that I had the privilege to visit. We'll actually talk to the teacher who facilitated this classroom in a little bit. But I think, Kirk, if you just want to get the slideshow started. We did talk about, as facilitators, kind of the challenge of not only joining you virtually today, but the limitations of the platform in terms of being interactive. We know that we're all here to learn more about interactive and collaborative ways of teaching and learning. So although we do have some limitations, we do know that you can, as participants, communicate with us through the chat. So that's how we'd like to start. If you'd like to, in your chat, which you hopefully will see on the right-hand side of your screen, start to think about what you notice and wonder as these pictures scroll through, and just maybe make some brief notes of what you notice and what you wonder about what you're seeing. That's great to get that first comment because we know that everybody can hear us, or at least one other person can hear us. So that's great. Just to kind of start to summarize what we're getting as feedback. Students are working in groups. Students are not in desks. They are standing. We can see by some of the video as well as the still images that there appears to be collaboration and talking. Someone talked about the vertical workspaces and asked about that. So we'll definitely be touching on that. Various use of materials, both low and high tech. And the creating of the groups is another interesting concept that someone has mentioned that they wondered about. And so actually you've kind of had an opportunity to peek into the classroom that I had the privilege to visit. And it's a classroom of Kirk Keating, who's a teacher here in CCRCE and is actually just coming on with our mathematics team as a coach. That last comment, I just have to voice it, appear to be engaged in what they're doing. And that's really hopefully the message that you'll leave with today is, we know as teachers, we often have pebbles in our shoes and we often scratch our heads and wonder, how can we engage kids in the curriculum and with each other and help them to create meaning to move their mathematics forward? And so hopefully today you'll get a little taste of what that looks like and some tips on how you might get started, some strategies on how you might get started to support your kids in moving towards thinking and conceptual understanding. And we'll have the privilege also of hearing about some of the research that kind of led us to where we all are here today. So as I said, I'm going to hand it off to Kirk, and he's going to talk a little bit about what you've seen.
So I'm going to take a few steps back before I got there with the thinking classroom and implementing it. When I started teaching, it wasn't pretty. And as you can see in some of these images and GIFs, it really depicts how I taught and how my students experience math. And I'm going to start with the top left corner. That's me bringing passion into the classroom at the front of the room, usually talking louder and getting more excited as I showed my students what to do step by step by step. That middle picture, I'm thinking that's me showing students how to do solve a two-step equation, step by step by step in front of the room. And the top right is me trying to integrate some tech into my classroom, but showing them first before they're even involved in the process. And in the bottom, those were my students. Not all of them, but a great deal of them. I quickly saw that they weren't engaged coming into the classroom, and it took me a while to really start to get into that reflective cycle and to, dig into some research and really find ways to bring that engagement into the classroom. And I think I reflected a lot on this in the last few years. I think one main reason, when I started to teach, I taught how I was taught. I was always in the front of the room, telling students how to do math, or how I thought math was done. I continued to teach like this for quite a while. And it wasn't until I participated in a professional learning session as a learner. It was in Calgary at the time, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I walked into the room, and the first thing I noticed is that teachers were huddled around, kind of loosely gathered around a whiteboard space. And it wasn't a typical whiteboard. It was a thin, rectangular, vertical whiteboard that was, I remember it was taped on the wall with, I think, painter's tape. And all the teachers were just kind of hanging around. We were kind of talking. There was a bit of suspense in the room. This was something new. And I remember the facilitator. I don't think she even introduced herself. First thing she did, she had a Rubik's Cube in her hand. And she said, and I think just right after she picked up the cube, everybody stopped talking. And she said, imagine if I were to drop this cube into a bucket of red paint. Took the cube out and I let it dry. After it was dry, I picked it up and I threw it against the wall. Every cube within that Rubik's Cube came apart. And then she set the cube down. She said, your challenge is to figure out how many small cubes have 0 faces covered in paint, how many have 1 face covered in paint, 2 faces, 3 faces, 4 faces, 5 faces, and 6 faces covered in paint. Then I remember her shuffling cards immediately after she said this, shuffling cards. And she started to randomly walk towards teachers with a card. And I remember getting the 3 of clubs. So I look at this 3 of clubs, and I'm trying to figure out my next move. So I remember looking around, and there was different cards positioned taped beside the whiteboard space. And I remember looking around, and I saw teachers kind of holding up their card and kind of matching. And I remember immediately going to that space. And there was me and 2 other teachers with a 3, I think. One had a 3 of diamonds and 3 of hearts. From there, we were engaged in that task. We were standing up vertically, working with, I think there was 1 whiteboard marker at the time. And we were engaged in this task, this low floor, high ceiling task. I think it was for 45 minutes. And just to experience that as a learner and to struggle. And I remember looking around the room when I was stuck. We were talking as a group. We didn't know what our next step was. So I remember looking around the room. Far right corner, there was a group, and they had something on their board that really got me to that next step. So we were sharing information within the group, engaging in this painted cube task. And then I remember the facilitator. As we were doing this, we were working in the perimeter. She was in the middle. She was in the middle, and she was watching us engage in this task. And then I remember her walking over to, it wasn't our group at first. She walked over to a group. And I don't know what she said, but she didn't say a whole lot. And I could just see the excitement in the teachers after she said what she said. And then I remember coming over to us. And we solved how many faces, a 3 by 3 by 3. And I think her next question for us, what about a 4 by 4 by 4? And we're just so engaged. And it was through that, as we worked through that, at the end of the task, we did a little gallery walk. So we went to each group, and I remember her asking, I remember only one question. And the question was, what do you think this group was thinking? And I think she just pointed to the whiteboard space. What do you think this group was thinking? And the conversation that started from that and the learning within that environment was unbelievable. So that, as a learner, that really impacted me. And I knew that had to be the main ingredient that I had to take back and have my students experience. And I remember her giving me 4 things at the end of the session. She gave me a white book, so those little vertical whiteboards. She gave me a deck of cards, and she gave me a book with a lot of different low floor, high ceiling tasks, a lot of thinking tasks. And the last thing she gave me a name, a researcher, a former teacher, somebody that she said I had to follow on Twitter, and I had to really, really look at his work. And that was Peter Liljedahl. So I was so excited. I brought back these 4 things. Some things hands-on, the other, somebody with an idea. And I tried it the next day. And I remember I tried that exact same task. I tried the painted cube task with my grade 9 students. I began with that problem, and I tried to model it almost identical to Jocelyn. So I started with the problem, took 3 or 4 minutes. Students were working in visibly random groups, and I did the same thing. I shuffled after I gave my little script, and I handed those cards out to my students, groups of 3. All my students were working in the perimeter of my room. I know I only had 1 white book, but I had a lot of windows. I had a lot of whiteboard space that I used for students to work at. And I was blown away of how much engagement that was brought into the classroom. I could visibly see them thinking. I didn't have to tell them to start talking. They were sharing ideas. They were walking around the room in excitement, sharing those ideas. And I tried to model that consolidation as well with a gallery walk towards the end. We didn't quite finish that consolidation because there was so much excitement, but I knew this was something that I needed to stick with. I needed to stay in that reflective cycle. So I remember it was a few days after I tried that first task, and I followed up with some more tasks, and I said I need to stay within this reflective cycle to keep implementing this framework. So I started to follow Peter on Twitter. I started to follow Laura, Alex, Kirsten, Jordan, Alicia. And what I saw on Twitter was what I was seeing in my class. I saw videos of students that were thinking, students that were making and creating their own knowledge. And it was truly amazing. So as I moved to Nova Scotia, I had those first 3 practices. I really had those implemented well. The consolidation piece, I was working on, but I knew I needed to dive in a little more into Peter's research. So I started to look into, more of the practices, more of the 14 practices. So this is just a picture of what what a typical class looks like. Students working vertically, randomized groups. And I knew I had to continue this. Luckily, last year, Peter's book was for sale. So Building Thinking Classrooms. Again, I knew I had to stay in that reflective cycle and to continue to connect with educators that, were implementing this, thinking about implementing this. So I had the great opportunity to join a Twitter book chat that Laura Wheeler put on. And it was a step-by-step process looking at, the first chapter, thinking about questions, maybe some concerns, and sharing how our students experience this. And it was amazing. Getting out of your comfort zone and trying something new, I think is a huge part of change. Not only thinking about change, but kind of making change. And I knew I had to stay in that reflective cycle and keep diving in, learning more, as a math teacher and a math learner. So this is where Michelle and I had the idea to start a podcast, to start kind of reflecting and sharing some of the things we've been seeing and some of the things, students have been experiencing in math class. And I remember we had two episodes kind of drafted up, and we were working through those. And I remember drafting up an email, and it probably took me about an hour. I drafted up an email asking Peter if he would be, if we were able to interview him on our podcast. And it took me an hour. I did so many edits. I know I asked Michelle 5 or 6 times, should I send it? Should I send it? And, yeah, send it. So I sent it. And I remember Peter emailed me back very, very quickly after. And he said, I'd love to. So it was there that I knew that I had to share this with others. Michelle and I, we really want Nova Scotia teachers to see what this looks like, and to really think about providing students an opportunity to think through tasks, to make mistakes, and to be in that messy middle part of mathematics. And we really have the opportunity today to really learn and reflect on our own teaching practices and what we can provide our students as far as mathematics. So I'd like to introduce one of our math heroes, Peter Liljedahl.
Okay, so thank you, Kirk. Let's see, are we seeing my PowerPoint up on the screen now? Are you hearing me, Kirk?
Yeah, I can hear you, Peter.
And I'm going to share my screen. And are you, let me know if you're seeing it.
Yep.
Yeah, I can see it now.
All right, awesome. So for me, like Kirk, this is sort of an interesting presentation because we started with the end with those notice wonder about things that are happening in Kirk's classroom. And then Kirk took us back in time about how he grew into this teacher that he is now. And I'm going to likewise go backwards. So this is a backwards presentation. I'm going to take you backwards in time as to where all this started for me. So it was mentioned at the beginning that I'm a former math teacher. I am. I taught in the Vancouver School District. And 18 years ago or so, I was working on my PhD and I had stepped out of the classroom. So I was just focused on my studies at the time, always with the intention of going back in the classroom. And what happened was there was a series of events that caused me to have an opportunity to visit a whole bunch of different classrooms, which for me was a huge privilege to be able to visit different teachers. And the way this came about was I emailed teachers. I asked colleagues of mine to recommend to me teachers that they had heard were good. And then I would email those teachers and ask if I could come in and watch them teach. And when I was in there visiting them, watching them teach, I would ask them to recommend to me other teachers that they had heard were good. And so it was that I was able to visit 40 different classrooms in 40 different schools. And because I was following this thread of good teacher, I got to visit classrooms from kindergarten to grade 12. I was in low socioeconomic settings, high socioeconomic settings. I was in private schools and public schools, French schools, English schools. I got to see a very diverse collection of 40 classrooms. And yet everywhere I went, despite how diverse these settings were, everywhere I went, I saw the same thing. I saw students not thinking. At least not thinking in ways that we know students need to be doing in order to be successful in future grades. That's not to say there wasn't activity. There was lots of activity. The students were working, they were taking notes, they were doing worksheets, they were doing some manipulative activity. They were doing lots and lots of things. But none of those things actually required them to think in ways that we know students need to think. And at first, this was just a sense that I was having. But when I dug in and I did some really deep research into if students aren't thinking, what is it they're actually doing? And from that emerged what came to be my baseline data. And the baseline data showed that it wasn't entirely true that nobody was thinking. The baseline data showed that in a typical lesson, 20% of students would spend 20% of their time thinking. And 80% of students spend 0% of their time thinking. And that meant that in a class of 30 students, 5 or 6 students spent between 8 and 12 minutes thinking. And then the rest of the students and those students for the rest of the time were not thinking, at least not in ways that would be beneficial to students in the future. This is a problem because thinking is a necessary precursor to learning. If students are not thinking, they're not learning. So this became something that sort of motivated my journey for a long time. The other thing I noticed when I visited these 40 classrooms was that these were really good teachers. They were good teachers. I had not been steered wrong. Despite the fact that I was seeing students not thinking, these teachers were dedicated professionals. They cared about their students. They knew their content. They cared that the students learned the content. But they were in a tough position. They had students who weren't thinking, and that was shaping who they were as teachers. And I remember some of the teachers saying to me, this is not why I became a teacher. I became a teacher because I wanted to share my passion for mathematics. And yet what I feel like I'm doing is I'm cutting curriculum into bite-sized pieces and pre-chewing it to the students before I feed it to them. Very much like Kirk was describing himself as an early teacher. And what was really clear to me was these good teachers were affected by the nature of the students that they had in front of them. The other thing I noticed was that everywhere I went, classrooms looked more alike than they looked different. Yes, there's differences. Of course there's differences. But in some cases, those differences are very subtle. There was multiple times where I would walk into a room and I would say, no, I've been in this classroom. I wanted 40 different classrooms in 40 different schools. And I would look at my digital photos and yep, there it is. I've been in this classroom. Look at my logbook. No, different building. Classrooms are so much alike. And what happened in these classrooms was so much alike from classroom to classroom. There was this sort of rhythm, this sort of set pattern of teaching that I kept seeing everywhere I went. There was this direct instruction where the teacher would show how to do something. Then the teacher would go through this Q&A period where they would ask questions and students would answer. Maybe a student would volunteer to share something. But all of these lessons ended with students working individually in their seats. And what's interesting about this is that the way classrooms look and what happens in classrooms has been the same for a very long time. Yeah, we've gone from blackboards to whiteboards to smart boards, and the chair's not always attached to the desk anymore. Fundamentally, what has changed in the last 150 years in our practice? What's different? Right? Like what? Yeah, we've introduced technology, and our manipulators are better. Our textbooks have color in them, but students are still sitting and teachers are still standing, and that rhythm of practice is unchanged. And what this means is that the way we behave in our classrooms is not structured around classroom norms as much as institutional norms. It means that what we do in the room, everyone is doing in the room. And in many ways, these norms are non-negotiable, which means that we don't really feel that we can change this. This is how teaching is. This is how classrooms look. This is the resources I'm given. And I started to wonder, if this is true, then maybe the fact that everywhere I'm going, I'm seeing students not thinking is connected to these institutionally normative structures. And if that is true, then in order to get students to think in ways that are going to be beneficial to them, we're going to have to start to break institutional normative structures. And that became my research. And for the next 15 years, I worked with over 400 teachers on 2-week cycles. And what we were doing was we were renegotiating the non-negotiated norms. We were breaking norms to see if we could get students to think. And our only goal was to get more students thinking and thinking for longer than what the baseline data was showing. And we were willing to try anything. And we were going to break these norms for 2 weeks and see if it had an effect. And as a result, we conducted thousands of micro-experiments. And at first, this research was chaotic. We were just trying things and having fun, seeing if we could get students to think. But eventually, this research was organized around 14 variables. And these 14 variables happen to be the core classroom practices that every teacher does. Now, that's not entirely true. If you're teaching kindergarten, you don't have your students doing notes per se. But these are the 14 core practices that every teacher enacts. And how we enact them actually makes us unique as teachers. So if I want to compare two teachers, I could compare them across these 14 variables. Because how we enact each of these is what gives us our unique teaching DNA. But I wasn't so interested in that uniqueness. What we were interested in was finding the optimal practices for thinking. That is, how do we enact each of these variables so that we get students thinking more and more students thinking? So for example, is there an optimal way to answer questions that gets more students thinking? Is there an optimal set of tasks that gets students thinking more? Is there a way to consolidate a lesson that promotes more thinking? Is there a way to do formative assessment that gets students thinking more? Is there a way to have students do homework or write notes that actually keeps them thinking? And is there an optimal way to do that so that we get the most thinking out of students? And that became our research. And after time and over time, results started to emerge until eventually we had the 14 optimal practices for thinking. And Kirk shared with us those first 3 practices, the 3 practices that he experienced in that workshop and that he took away and enacted in his classroom on that first day. So number 1, if we want students to think, we need to give them something to think about. And in mathematics, that comes in the form of a task, but not just any task. It has to be a thinking task. And Kirk used language like low floor and high ceiling, and those are parts of that. But what fundamentally is a thinking task is a task that students have not encountered before. Because thinking is what we do when we don't know what to do. If we know what to do, it's not thinking, it's mimicking, it's an exercise. So the painted cube is an excellent example. It's a task that students have not encountered before, so they have to think. And we have a catalog of these types of non-curricular thinking tasks. But one of the things to really remember is that the goal of thinking classrooms is not to find tasks that are engaging to students, but it's to build engaged students and then pointing them at any task. And our research has shown that we can get students thinking about the painted cube, but we can also get students thinking about adding 2 fractions or factoring a quadratic or completing a square or graphing a polynomial. We can get students thinking about all of these different types of curricular activities. The difference is that we have to make sure that we're asking them to think about them before we show how to do it. The second tool, once we've given students something to think about, we have to give them someone to think with. And it turned out that the optimal way to form collaborative groups was to do so randomly. And that's what Kirk talked about with these cards being handed out, but not just randomly, it had to be visibly random. Because when the randomness wasn't visible to the students believed we were just being strategic. So it had to be visibly random. The students had to see the randomness in it. And it had to be often, about once every 60 minutes. Showed that if we did this, students would think more. And the data is very clear on this. Using different grouping strategies, allowing teachers to group their students strategically or letting students group themselves, we asked a very simple question. If you know you're going to work in groups today to solve a problem, what is the likelihood you would contribute an idea? And when we did ask that question in the context where teachers grouped students strategically or let students group themselves, less than 50% of students said that they would offer an idea. Once we implemented frequent random groups, 2 weeks later, we asked the same question. 100% of students said that they would offer an idea. 100% of students were willing to be thinkers. And that practice alone will transform your classroom. Every teacher who has implemented frequent, visible, random groups comes back 2 or 3 weeks later and says, I have a community in a classroom like I've never had before. These students are thinkers, they care about each other, they're collaborative, it's amazing. Once we've given them something to think about and someone to think with, we have to give them somewhere to do the thinking. And what Kirk described was the students working on these vertical whiteboards. And that turned out to be true. The optimal place to have students do their thinking was on vertical, non-permanent surfaces, a vertical whiteboard. But it didn't have to be a whiteboard. It just had to be erasable. So it could have been a blackboard. It could have been a window, the side of a filing cabinet. It could have been a vinyl picnic table cover stapled up on a bulletin board, a sheet of cellophane taped up on the wall, or these white books that Kirk talked about, which are like flip chart paper, except thicker. And some of them are made of plastic, and you can just tape them up with painter's tape and the students work on them. It had to be non-permanent because when the students, and one of the things that emerged from this research was we always had answers before we had explanations. We didn't know why vertical non-permanent surfaces work better. They just did. It took us over a year to fully understand why that was optimal. So it had to be non-permanent because when it turns out when the students can erase easily, they're willing to risk more and risk sooner. They're willing to think more and think sooner. And it had to be vertical rather than having it on the table for a whole bunch of reasons. But the main one was this. It turned out that it wasn't that standing was so good, it was that sitting was so bad. Because when students are sitting, they feel anonymous. And it took us over a year to get at that result. When students are sitting, they feel anonymous. And the further they sit from the teacher, the more anonymous they feel. And the more things are between them and the teacher, the more anonymous they feel. And when students feel anonymous, they disengage. And that's both a conscious and a subconscious act. And getting them up on their feet took away their anonymity. They didn't feel anonymous, they didn't disengage. And these were game changers. And those 3 practices are only 3 of the 14 optimal practices. We found optimal ways to do notes and homework and formative and summative assessment and how to answer questions and when to give a task and where to give a task and how to arrange the furniture in our classroom. The research kept showing us over and over and over again that everything we do matters. And the research also kept showing us over and over and over again that the practices that are in that institutionally normative framework are not optimal. And they can't be, because when public education was created 150 years ago, it was created on the idea of creating conformity and compliance. We cannot use those same practices now to build 21st century learners that are creative, critical thinkers, right? We can't use those same practices to get students to think because that's not what they were designed for. But there they are. There are the 14 practices. And our next question became where to start. Because it turns out that no teacher can enact all 14 at once. And even if they could, the students wouldn't be able to cope with that amount of change. So our research became very focused on if we know what these 14 practices are, where do we start? And that research involved hundreds of teachers receiving professional development and be given some of these practices and being asked to implement these practices in different orders. And when that data came back, it showed us that there's a pseudo sequence here, a sequence that we want to implement these 14 practices in. We start with the top toolkit. And when that one has been enacted, we move to the second toolkit, which is the second circle there. And then we move our way down to the third and the fourth. And that first toolkit, because Kirk spoke so passionately about it, turns out to be using thinking tasks, random groups, and vertical surfaces. That turns out to be the place to start. And our research actually showed us that those three need to be enacted together. And when they do, what happens in your classroom is transformative. And once that's up and running, we can move to the second toolkit. And the second toolkit is we don't have to implement them all together. We implement one at a time in any order we want. It doesn't matter. And this is why it's called pseudo-sequential. Sometimes the order matters, sometimes it doesn't. And one of the key things that matters is that we start with these three practices. The research is so clear about that. And it took a long time for us to understand why that is. It turns out this first toolkit has nothing to do with you as the teacher. This first toolkit creates a new environment in which the students can be different and they can start to become thinkers. And remember what I said, that the teachers I was observing were affected, their teaching was affected by the learners they had in front of them. We cannot be thinking classroom teachers if our students are not thinking. So what I believe this data is showing us is that we first need to change the students so that they can start to become thinkers, and then we can start to work on ourselves to become thinking classroom teachers. And that's what that second toolkit is all about. And together, this whole framework is called the Building Thinking Classroom Framework. And it's made up of the 14 practices. And if you're interested in more information about it, as Kirk mentioned, there is a book. And the way this book is laid out is that each practice corresponds to a chapter. So if you're interested in understanding more about random groups, that's practice number 2, it's chapter 2. If you're interested in about how to do the consolidation, that's practice 10, chapter 10. And when we put all these practices together, this is what a classroom looks like. And you will notice that these students are not working on the painted cube problem. They're working on curriculum. You're also going to notice that the teacher, the bitter-looking teacher in the middle of the room, she is not the teacher. She's an observer from Spain trying to figure out what the fraction is going on in this classroom. The teacher is the tall guy with the high sideburns. That's Alex Overwich, and Kirk mentioned him as somebody he was following on Twitter. So this is what a thinking classroom looks like. And remember the baseline data. The baseline data told us that 20% of students were spending 20% of their time thinking, and the rest of the students were spending no time thinking. In this lesson, in this 85-minute lesson, 93% of the students spent 100% of the class time thinking, and 7% of the students spent 50% of the class time thinking. And that's what a thinking classroom looks like. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kirk.
Yeah, and I think just echoing, there's so many great messages, but I think the biggest thing is you see your students differently. And after implementing this framework, I know, Michelle, you and I talked a lot about obviously the thinking and learning part, but the social and emotional learning that's happening as well is phenomenal, isn't it?
It really is. And just to kind of go with that theme of going back in time, for Kirk, this started, like he talked about attending that session out west, but really it started for us in Nova Scotia when Kirk moved here and began teaching and reached out to me as the mathematics consultant for someone to collaborate with. Kirk talked about that reflective cycle and how important it was that he didn't do that alone. Not only did Kirk look to Twitter and to social media, but he wanted to collaborate here, as we talked about, on the ground in Nova Scotia. And so he reached out to me, and that reflective process started and Peter talked a little bit about those noticings that he was noticing in his classroom. And although he didn't have stats to support the non-thinking versus the thinking, it doesn't take a lot of time to be with students to know how engaged they are with the mathematics and how much thinking they're actually doing. So Kirk had those noticings and, like I said, reached out. And so what we would like to do, and what part of our goal today,
We can't hear you, Michelle.
sorry about that. When I went to click the chat. So yeah, so we want the opportunity to be able to take these practices and to collaborate and reflect and think about what's happening in our classrooms and how we can maybe move towards supporting students to be thinking students. And like Peter said, everything that we do in our classrooms matters, and the intentionality behind that can impact students in different ways. So we just, down in the bottom right corner there, what I put into the chat were a couple of links that hopefully will give us an opportunity in Nova Scotia as educators to start doing that. Or for those of you that have already started, to continue doing that. So there's 2 links that you'll see there. One is a list of resources that we've mentioned throughout the presentation. The other is a Word doc that you are welcome to fill in with your information so that we can start to reach out to each other and start to join together in that reflective cycle to network and to really come together to ask the important questions and take risks, like Kirk talked about taking risks, and like Peter talked about really challenging the institutional norms. It's tough to do that on your own. We need people to feel supported and feel like they're kind of not alone in it. So that's something that we'd like to do to move forward, to give everybody the opportunity to have kind of the privilege that we have had to work through this together.
Yeah, and just to echo that piece, we're really looking forward to Michelle and I and other educators to get out and to facilitate some thinking classroom tasks and have educators experience this, because I think that's, for me anyway, that's where it started. That's where that reflective cycle started. As a learner, I experienced it, and through struggle and through leaning on classmates at the time within the PD. So that's one of our big goals. Like Michelle said, we want to continue this and share this with Nova Scotia educators. We had the opportunity this year to share a session at Scottsburn, and we had this was an elementary teaching group, and they had a lot of really good feedback, and they finished doing a book study club as well. So yeah, we're looking to connect, collaborate, and just we want our students to see and experience this.
I think too, it's worth mentioning that in the fall, October Provincial Conference, you will see this presentation on the list of sessions available too, and it'll be kind of a next step forward and a deeper dive into these practices. So thinking about starting in September and moving forward, like we said, it's tough to do it on your own, to challenge these institutional norms that have been so much embedded in our schools and in our students. So that would be another opportunity for us to reconnect and maybe do some reflection and conversation over where we are in terms of thinking about implementing, or maybe even implementing that first toolkit.
That's right. And that first toolkit, it's like Alex said, it's like a sledgehammer. It really shocks the system, and you see your students behave differently. It's truly amazing that implementing that first toolkit after I saw my students experiencing that was amazing. So I think what we'll do now is, what questions do you have? Maybe about implementing, or maybe about research, or anything in general in regards to building thinking classrooms.
Well, while we're waiting for people to ask questions, maybe I can ask you a question, Kirk, and maybe
Sure.
you, Michelle. So what do your students say when they get to experience this? What do they say to you immediately when it happens, and at the end of the year?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I find during the task they're so engaged that there's no questions or comments there, but it's after that consolidation piece when we're as a group and just kind of asking how did that go, and just the excitement, and you can tell you helped start a community. They love it. They love working vertically. They love erasing if they make a mistake. And I think the biggest thing I was worried at first with the visible random groups. I think I got kind of hung up on that, thinking that they wouldn't really buy into working with other students. And it was a total opposite. I didn't have to once say, no, you're working and thinking with this group. It's immediate. Yeah.
And Peter, I had the privilege that you spoke about visiting someone else's classroom and having those conversations with students. I know you mentioned in your book and in your research that often students will tell you a different kind of story than they might tell you if you're their classroom teacher. And what I found really interesting was storytelling is becoming a huge part of pedagogy now, with culturally responsive pedagogy, and certainly with the way that thinking tasks are facilitated in the classroom. And one of the best moments was when Kirk was facilitating a task. It was the baker's task, and he started to tell a story to the students to introduce the task about, when I retire, I'm going to open a cake shop, and because I love math, I'm going to be cutting the cakes differently every day. And so today we're going to explore the cost of each piece if each cake is $10. And as he's telling this, like, the kids are like, are you really going to do this, Mr. Keating? Like, are you? So that whole storytelling to get kids engaged right away and entering into the task within the first few minutes of class is really, really something to see, because then it gets the ball rolling, right? Once they're invested, then anything can happen.
And they hung on to that task, Michelle and Peter. I'll show it in a few minutes, but it was the last few days of school, and we were doing some some puzzles, different tasks, and they were talking about that and asking questions and kind of making up their own silly cakes. And I had an idea. I said, would this be something you're interested in? I said, would you guys record yourselves introducing this task and maybe make like an animation or a GIF? And they did. And I'm going to share that if you don't mind.
We are going to open a bakery that makes square cakes. We will call our restaurant Creative Cake Cuts. Each day of the week, we will plan on cutting squares in creative ways. On our order board and menu, we will plan to list the fraction of each piece, the decimal value of each piece, and the cost of each piece. We will be selling each square cake for $10. Your challenge is to help us create our menu. Creative Cake Cuts!
Can you see and hear that all right?
We are going to open a bakery that makes square cakes. We will call our restaurant Creative Cake Cuts. Each day of the week, we will plan on cutting squares in creative ways. On our order board and menu, we will plan to list the fraction of each piece, the decimal value of each piece, and the cost of each piece. We will be selling each square cake for $10. Your challenge is to help us create our menu. Creative Cake Cuts!
So that was just something that was so special. It was I could tell that task, the way they thought through that task and continued to think about that was so impactful.
So there's a question about how to implement this in a social distance space. So I will just share this. So there's a supplement to this book coming out in September. And this supplement is how to modify it for different settings, one of which, the table of contents, is on the right. You'll see chapter 1 is how to build a thinking classroom with social distancing. So there is definitely ways to do this. The answer to that question is long, but it turns out it's not that difficult to modify that.
And Peter, there was a question about group size.
Yeah, okay. So what's interesting about this is that the research showed that the optimal group size is 3, except for in primary. At the beginning of, especially in kindergarten and grade 1, we start with groups of 2 and then we work our way up to groups of 3. But the ideal was 3, and it took us a long time, like everything else in this research, to understand why. The data was clearly showing us 3 was best. But why? And it turns out that the answer comes from complexity theory. Complexity theory says that in order for a group to be successful and effective, it has to have a balance of what's called redundancy and diversity. So redundancy are the things that the students have in common. So common language, common notation, common knowledge. They need to have some things in common in order to be able to even start talking to each other. But if all they have is redundancy, then the group is no stronger than the individual, right? The group also needs to have diversity. Diversity is what every member of the group brings that's different. And that's what creates strong groups. And what we saw was when the group size went up, the diversity went up. That's good, but the redundancy went down. That's bad. On the other hand, when the group size went down, the redundancy went up, but the diversity went down. And what we found was groups of 3 had that perfect balance of redundancy and diversity. And it just kept showing us diversity is a strength. Diversity is a strength. And this kept revealing itself in the explorations as well, because when you randomize students, you don't always get diversity. You randomize students, sometimes you get the 3 strongest students together. And often the teacher would say, oh, that group is going to rock. And rarely was that true. Rarely was that true. It was often the group that the teacher didn't expect to function well that outperformed the other groups. Diversity is a strength. So Lisa, to your comment about the new book, please understand that the new book is a supplement to the main book. Reading just the new book will not make sense unless you've also read the orange book, the anchor book, the main book.
Somebody did ask if the book is available on the Book Bureau here in Nova Scotia, and I believe it is. We certainly recommended it to the province when they asked our region for recommendations to be added. That was one of our recommendations, and I believe that the last we heard that it had been added.
There's a question on how to make room for vertical workspaces. So, we've implemented this in literally thousands and thousands of classrooms in Canada, US, and Europe and around the world. We've never seen a classroom we couldn't hack. There's always a way to get enough vertical surfaces into a classroom. And don't go for the big budget. Don't go to your principal and say, I need 10 whiteboards and that's going to cost $20,000 and I'm willing to wait 18 months for that to happen. That's not the way to start. Just hack it. Use the white books that Kirk talked about. They're easy to find online. Maybe one of us will put a link up for it. A vinyl picnic table cover is really good. The kind with a bit of fuzz on the back. Don't get the sunflower pattern one. It's distracting. Cellophane, the stuff you make gift baskets out of. Buy a roll of that. Tape up 2x3 sheets on whatever surface you can. Use the windows, the side of a file cabinet. There's a product at home improvement stores called Shower Board. It's like the back of your IKEA cabinet. It's a medium density fiber board with a white melamine finish. It's rigid. You can get a 4x8 sheet for about $30. There are so many ways to do this. All you really need to do is get at the walls, which means you're going to have to remove some of the bookshelves from the edges. You're going to have to move your posters up or down so that you can or just mount this stuff over top of the posters. Stop reserving so much space on the whiteboard for that list of students who have assignments due and who have warnings and the daily plan and stuff like that. You have the space. You do have the space. You just have to get at it.
And it was interesting for me this year. I had one math group in a lab, so a bigger space, and I had one group in a smaller classroom. And I found the group in the smaller classroom were the tightness of the group really benefited them as far as mobilizing knowledge and sharing ideas and thinking. So yeah, the size of the room isn't an issue as well.
So I'm putting up the link for the Whitebook flip chart here. They have 2 versions of it. You get 10 sheets for about $50. If they're not having a sale, they're cheaper. There's a paper-based one, which is the one that Kirk was experiencing the first time. Those ones they will tear because they are paper-based, but they are erasable and they're easy to keep clean. If you're going to use the paper-based ones, I recommend putting duct tape around the edges to just strengthen them. And the more if you just leave them up on the wall, they'll last for years. It's the up and down, up and down, up and down that causes the tearing. And they have a premium product that is plastic-based that is unterrible. You cannot tear it. It is indestructible. It's a little bit more money. Scholastic, I think it is, makes a product called Better Than Paper as well. It comes in these rolls. It looks like butcher paper. It does not look like it would be erasable. You look at it, you go, there's no way this is erasable. But you write on it with a whiteboard marker, it's erasable, and it's very inexpensive. And I've been in classrooms where they've had a sheet of that is 20 feet long along the entire length of one wall. And yeah, so like I said, we've never met a teacher who couldn't get this up and running for less than $100. And once you're up and running, then you go to your administrator and say, hey, look what's happening in here. Can we upgrade to some whiteboards?
And use painter's tape from the get-go. Painter's tape is great.
Yeah. So Angela mentioned this idea of anonymity and engagement. This was huge for us. And like I said, it took a long time to get at that. Interviewing students can be difficult, but finally we started to get this hint of a thread of an idea that students felt anonymous when they were sitting. And then we were able to use that to pry open more students' thinking and discussion on this. And there's another interesting outcome of that I didn't mention. It means that in a classroom where students are sitting, those students have inequitable access to mathematics. Because the further a student sits from the teacher, the more likely they are to disengage, which means that the students near the teacher have more opportunities for engagement than the students that are far from the teacher. And we know this innately. We bring students to the front when we need them to pay attention and so on. But removing the anonymity really created more equitable access to mathematics for the students. Well, according to my clock, we're right up against the end of it.
Yeah, so I think we'll leave you with just a few more images just from the start, and if you want to kind of reflect a little bit more, maybe something you learned, something maybe you noticed a second time around this little slideshow, and we'll leave you with that.